Okay. Yeah, so I'm Eric Lerner, and I'm going to sort of talk about the process by which a movement of working people could become victorious, and how victories have been won in the past. I mean, the basic question, the really basic question, it was sort of posed by the poet Shelley 200 years ago, when he said, "We are many, they are few." And we were talking during the discussion period about who was the ruling class. The ruling class is literally a few thousand people worldwide, the class of the billionaires. Working people are billions. So the basic question is, if power is to be transferred from the few to the many, really the only question is, how do the many unite? The only way a few thousand people can rule over billions of people is if the billions are disunited. So there is an actual real historical process that we can study of the working class trying to come together and in part succeeding. And the first really scientific attempt to describe this process was by the German revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, studying the process that led to the abortive 1905 revolution in Russia. And she described this as the mass strike process. Now, what is a mass strike? Well, a mass strike is very different than the sort of things that we here in the United States associate with strikes. A strike today is a certain group of people organized into a labor union going out on strike against a certain employer for a designated amount of time. A mass strike is completely different. A mass strike is an open-ended mass movement of working people, ever growing behind a common set of demands that poses the threat of loss of power to the ruling class. Now, I think the easiest way to see what does that mean is to look at a historical example. The biggest mass strike that ever occurred in history was actually in a developed democratic country, which was the mass strike in May 1968 in France. Now, to most of you, this is history. This is 50 years ago. There are some of us who remember it well. But this occurred in a country that is actually not that dissimilar from present-day United States, because in France in '68 you already had television, radio, mass media. You didn't have the web yet, but you had modern communication. France was an industrialized society. What happened? Well, at this time, the government that was led by Charles de Gaulle, who had been in power for about 10 years, had launched a major campaign of austerity. And this campaign of austerity was directed both against workers generally, cuts in pension, cuts in working class rights on the job, restrictions on wage increases, and there was a specific set of austerity aimed at the university students. Now, at that time, most students in France did not go to the university. It was a limited system, but they were trying to restrict it further, to cut the amount of money going into the universities. And these so-called reforms, this austerity, was actually put in place in 1967. And there was a growing campaign to roll back these reforms, which were called the Fouché reforms, both among workers and among students. And of course, there was a background, the geopolitical background, because this was during the period of the Vietnam War. France was not directly involved in the war, but the movement against the American involvement in the war by this time had become global. So, in early May of 1968, there were demonstrations in a suburban university near Paris. And this university, the demonstrations of the students became so great that the authorities shut the university down temporarily to quash the demonstrations. And these students went for help to the leading university of Paris and of France, the Sorbonne. And there started to be large demonstrations of students in support of these suburban students at the Sorbonne. And the de Gaulle regime was completely opposed to any demonstrations that were challenging these reforms. So not only the police came and, attacked the students, there was also their equivalent of the National Guard called the CRS. And you started to have major battles in the streets of Paris. The reaction of the students to this repression, and this is characteristic of the mass strikes, was to spread the protests. So these protests now spread to the entire university system in Paris. You had major demonstrations. You had the students starting to set up barricades to protect themselves against the police. And in the course of a week, this became essentially a student strike throughout Paris. The repression continued, and at that point there was more and more pressure on the workers' organizations to get involved, because workers had come to see that, this struggle was connected with the attacks on themselves. So there was a basic idea of unity in opposition to these austerity measures. So there was a huge demonstration called by both the unions and the students for Paris. It was a one-day general strike, and there were about 1 million people in the streets of Paris, which of course pretty much swept the police from the streets. In the immediate wake, now these events are happening very rapidly. This is only a week after the demonstration started. In the immediate wake of this, the students at the Sorbonne occupied the university. They did basically a sit-in protest. The following day, the workers at one of the major defense plants in suburban Paris, Sud Aviation, occupied their plant. Within days, you had 1 million workers out on strike and occupying their plants. Within 2 weeks, that movement had gotten to 10 million workers, approximately half the French workforce. That would be the equivalent in the United States today of about 50 million workers on strike occupying their plants. By that time, the demands had gone from purely defensive, which was the revocation of these Fouché reforms, to offensive, to a 50% increase in the minimum wage, to a decrease in the working hours, which at that time were 48 hours a week to 40 hours a week. The workers began to organize, together with the students, strike committees that started to organize initially neighborhoods and entire cities. And because the strike was general, they had to organize the supply of emergency supplies to keep the hospitals running, to essentially take over the role of running society. At this point, by the middle of May, the question of who holds power was very much a question. And people started talking about, could we have a national strike committee? Could we actually take power from the ruling class? But overall, the organizations were not sufficiently prepared. What happened was the biggest trade unions under the leadership of the French Communist Party said, we must reach an agreement with the government. The government said, if these demonstrations don't stop, we will call in the army. And in a fairly short period, at the end of May, the government and the trade union leadership reached an agreement which involved significant concessions, but eventually led to the demobilization of these strikes. But an enormous fear had been put into the hearts of the ruling class, and in the immediate sequel to this mass strike, and there were smaller mass strikes that followed, the wages in France rose by approximately 30% in real terms. There was a great reduction in the hours of work. Eventually, the hours of work, as we know today, in France became much less than the hours in the United States, while in '67 they had been much greater. So real concessions were given, but a revolution did not occur. So this is an example of the mass strike process in a developed country. There are certain characteristics of these mass strikes. Now, these mass strikes are not frequent events, but they're not unique. We have had mass strikes in the United States. There were mass strikes, for example, in San Francisco, Minneapolis, and Toledo, all occurring simultaneous at the height of the Great Depression in 1934. There have been mass strikes as recently as a few years ago in Quebec over similarly attacks on the free university system. And, of course, there were the mass strikes that Rosa Luxemburg studies in 1905 and the mass strikes that eventually led in 1917 to the Russian Revolution. Now these movements have certain clear characteristics. One is they are based on a sense of widespread sense within the working class that those who are in struggle represent the common interest of the entire class. The struggles are underlined by some sense of common demands, even if they were initially perhaps entirely defensive demands, but demands that cover huge sections of the entire class. And third is, they are almost always either set off or further provoked by repression on the part of the ruling class, the use of force against the movement and the working class mobilizing in defense of those who are being attacked. So the process of these mass strikes is the real process in actual events of workers coming to the realization that they have common interests as a class. This is the distinction that Marx made between a class in itself, a class that exists economically, such as workers who have to sell their labor to exist, and a class for itself, a class that self-consciously has interests as a class, such as our present-day capitalist class. Members of this capitalist class, this class of billionaires, are conscious that they have interests as a class, and they have institutions, the boards of directors, these interlocking boards of directors, much of the way the government functions, the institutionalized forums that they have, such as the Davos Forum, of formulating how these interests can best be protected. This is what the working class does not have day to day under capitalism, and comes to have during these mass strikes. And the final characteristic of these mass strikes is that they throw up characteristic democratic institutions, whether they are called strike committees or workers' councils the Soviets of Russia, or whatever, they are institutions where people directly debate and decide the issues that confront the movement. Now, how is that relevant all to today's situation? Well, one thing we have today is the embryo of a unifying process within the working class, which is people see Trump as a common enemy. Trump and those who, his circle have directly gored an awful lot of oxes. He has attacks on immigrants, he has attacks on Hispanics generally, he has attacks on Muslims, he has attacks on women, attacks on workers' rights, he attacks on the public education system. You look at the coverage of his political appointees and their views, and basically he has attacks on almost every section of the working class. His whole persona has essentially torn the mask off of the capitalist agenda, which under Obama has been pretty well masked, because you had Obama, who was clearly a smooth, sophisticated sort of person, who was able to carry out some very regressive policies, like Jay pointed out, the mass deportation of nearly 3 million people, without stirring mass opposition because of this mask of civility. Well, that mask of civility is off. So we have the potential that I think a lot of people see of unifying the movement in opposition to what's going on. But clearly, to get to the point where mass strikes can break out, we need to concretize that opposition into a positive program. Now, one of the points that Luxemburg made about mass strikes is that they can't be called into existence. They actually are, to a large extent, spontaneous events. But what she equally emphasized is they are events that can be prepared. The events in France were prepared by months of organizing, and to a certain extent, years of organizing, of activists talking to students, talking to workers about the common interests in opposing this austerity attack. Similarly today, a key part of the organizing program has to be winning more and more of the working population, of the participants in various activist movements, to a common program, to the point where it becomes common sense that, yes, of course we need free education. Yes, of course we need free medical health, free housing. Yes, of course it should be the wealthy and the corporations who pay for it. Yes, of course we need the protection of the rights of all who live here, including, by the way, the right to strike. Because in this country, the right to strike is extremely restricted. Those laws, as in the 1930s, there has to be the sense that these laws are unjust and have to be thrust aside. And finally, as we move inevitably into the next economic crisis, whenever that's not going to be long postponed, there will be the sense that, yes, of course, we're not going to bail out the banks, we're not going to bail out the financial system. These have to become taken over and become run democratically as a public financial system. So that unity of interest becoming generalized has to be the first step to getting this process of mass strikes underway. here in the United States and globally, because this program really is pretty much what is needed in almost every country. The second characteristic that we need is that we need to succeed, we need a movement that aims consciously for power, for the power to change society fundamentally. We're going to have a whole nother forum about the question of elections. But clearly, I think, a movement that has an electoral arm that's independent of the Democrats and Republicans is necessary in the present time to show that what is aimed for is political power in all its forms. We know that elections by themselves are not going to change power, but elections are part of the process of gaining the legitimacy of ideas and altering the ability of the government to exercise its coercive power. And finally, we have to be popularizing the concept of democratic organization. Democratic organization meaning organization in which we are not electing representatives and trusting them to carry out our will, but democratic organization in the sense that we are only delegating delegates to carry out decisions that we have made. And that's the idea that these organizations have to come into existence, has to be widespread throughout the population, because during these mass strikes, which are very short periods, weeks or months, there really isn't enough time to popularize these ideas. So, if we can, over the coming year or 2 years, start to bring together our various organizations behind a common set of demands, around the idea that this mass strike process will happen, then mass strikes will break out. We can count on it. And in that process, initially those mass strikes will bring concessions, because the ruling class, as has happened historically, will react to any threat to its actual power by trying to demobilize the movement by giving real concessions. But if that movement is independently organized, those real concessions can instead increase the movement by showing that this is the route to victory. And that's what happened, for example, both in the 30s and the 60s, that initially these concessions enormously strengthened the movement. If the focus can be continued, that the concessions by themselves will not work, that there has to be a transfer of power to the democratically organized mass movement, then this process can lead not only to the defeat of Trump, but to the defeat of the entire capitalist process that's leading humanity to destruction, and can lay the foundations for a new world, for a world we really want. Thanks. Now, I want to just point to some resources which are out there. One is, even though we've had more than 100 years of experience with mass strikes since Rosa Luxemburg wrote this essay, it really is very perceptive. And it's available in books like this, but it's also available online in a thing called the Marxist Archive, which you can find very rapidly online. And the pamphlet is called The Mass Strike. So that's by Rosa Luxemburg. In addition, we've put out an issue, which is also available online, of mass strike. This is put out by a small organization called the International Luxemburgist Network. And this is available at luxemburgism.org. And we're also going to be reprinting this. This is essentially a survey of mass strikes since 1905. So let's open it up for more discussion.